David Saunders has been part of Extinction Rebellion here in Bristol almost since the start. He explains how the group that's now threatening to close Heathrow Airport for a week of drone attacks, how they do their business. And he looks at the thinking behind the so-called Third Industrial Revolution.
But the Hong Kong police are dealing with some demonstrators who've been blocking an airport. What would you think would happen if you and I sat down in Heathrow and blocked it for 5 days?
They weren't actually blocking the airport, Martin. They were protesting in the airport.
Well, the planes,
so that
planes couldn't fly.
Just a minute. They were protesting in the airport so that any people coming in and out of the country could see them, but they were not blocking the airport.
As I understood, lots of planes didn't fly.
Well, so that many planes were cancelled. That was by the airport.
Well, in any case,
the whole point of the demonstration was to do a peaceful demonstration inside the airport. Wouldn't stop people using the airport, but would make it very clear.
Yeah, but it's quite clear that some demonstrators, obviously not the majority, probably a small minority, are engaged in things which would be illegal in any country.
Interestingly, we could just quickly swerve to Heathrow, couldn't we? Because in 10 days' time or so, Extinction Rebellion are planning to shut down Heathrow for 10 days using drones. What do you make of that?
Well, I think I don't actually approve of that. I think it's a silly idea. But there you go.
Why?
Why? Because if you want people to listen to you and you've got a cause to push, disrupting their personal lives to that extent.
But isn't that what trade unions have been doing for hundreds of years?
Trade unions have to operate within a very.
But they disrupt people's lives, don't they?
Yes, they do. But they've got to do. They do. If you go on strike, there are rules about going on strike.
If you close down the railways or something.
Yes, of course. But if you use drones to close down an airport, that's not a strike, is it? And it could. I mean, the IRA nearly killed me when I was flying back from Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I just got into the terminal and they dropped a bomb onto the runway that I'd been on a few moments before. I heard it go off, and they were actually in a hotel right next to the runway, and they just dropped a mortar onto the runway. Now, that is a tactic.
Extinction Rebellion are not planning to do that.
No, I'm just saying, but if you're not prepared to go that far, perhaps you ought to just stick to the basics and just protest in a normal way. If you're not prepared to go that far, you're not serious, are you?
The argument is really that these drones are potentially extremely dangerous when it comes to aircraft.
If anybody gets killed as a result of that,
if they get ingested,
are they going to be happy with that?
If they get ingested into an engine, that can actually cause a plane to crash and hundreds of people to be killed. Yeah. So I don't know if Extinction Rebellion have really thought this through.
Well, the IRA, I don't think the IRA were trying to hit a plane. They were just trying to disrupt the airport. But if you by accident crash a plane with a load of people on, do you think that's going to make people take climate change more seriously?
Well, what they're saying is if we start flying drones around, actually they will stop at Heathrow. They'll stop.
Well, I mean, the anarchist idea of direct action behind what they're doing, I understand. But you've got to recognise that if you carry out direct action, which basically makes ordinary people lose their lives or be very seriously inconvenienced or injured, you're unlikely to get your cause regarded as a serious one. You're actually undermining your own position, and I would ask them to think very carefully about what they think they're doing there.
In fact, they have thought very carefully about it, because the people from Extinction Rebellion who are doing this are actually sort of trying to form a separate group. In fact, it's called Heathrow Pause, so that if planes do crash, that they won't be associated, hopefully, with Extinction Rebellion. So this is a sort of normal tactic, I suppose, Martin. Also, the authorities are threatening that these people, if they do this, could go down for very long prison sentences.
Well, if you're going to have non-violent protests of that kind, you've got to be prepared to take the prison sentences that go with your illegal action.
Well, it is potentially violent if a plane crashes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Never mind non-violent.
Well, exactly. So if you're not prepared to go the whole hog and drop a mortar bomb on them, perhaps you'd better just stick to chaining yourself to the railing.
I mean, do you think this actually using drones is actually more akin to a kind of armed struggle than a non-violent direct action?
This is the problem, isn't it? Where's the line to be drawn? Yeah.
Whereabouts, going back to Hong Kong, whereabouts do you think that is going to end up, that one? Because China is starting to increasingly point the finger at the UK, saying, we think you're encouraging this, and this is going to damage UK relations.
Well, I think that's pretty obvious that that we are encouraging it, and it is going to damage relations. I would suggest to the Chinese, do not send the Chinese army into Hong Kong, because that will crash the world economy for starters.
The Chinese army is already in Hong Kong. They've got about 6,000 or 7,000 soldiers in Hong Kong.
They're in their bases. They're allowed to be there because Hong Kong's part of China, but they shouldn't deploy them against the demonstrators. Leave it to the police, and the demonstrators will demonstrate as long as they want to demonstrate, and the police have just got to put up with it and deal with it in a responsible fashion.
Why do you think, and I am engaging with you, but I'm not sure you're engaging with me, why do you think so many people, even inside Extinction Rebellion, think that you have gone too far? When you recently said you wanted to put drones up around Heathrow to ensure that Heathrow Airport was closed down, there were people inside your own organisation who said, hang on a minute, that is not what we are about. You have to consider strategy in a way that you're not doing.
The fact of the matter is, with the aviation industry and the whole carbon economy, all this activity is bringing us to destruction. And there's people in Extinction Rebellion and in other networks who, as an act of conscience, are going to be taking action against it. Yeah, and that's the same as it happened in the past, right?
Again. I'll give you a quote from somebody, I don't know if you know him personally, but Simon McKibbin, a lecturer at Cambridge University, joined Extinction Rebellion, has now left, specifically because he was horrified and upset by your plan to shut down Heathrow with drones. He said, threatening to fly drones into a busy airspace is a departure from the ethics of non-violence. It threatens people, puts people at risk. He said, I believe if this is permitted to go ahead, we'll lose the goodwill of the public. Why do you persist with this?
Because we're facing mass starvation. And because people generally in society, and particularly people in the elites, are not capable and are not empathising with that reality.
Will you put those drones up?
Myself?
Well, you and those of your movement who believe like you that it's justifiable.
This is what's coming down the road. And if the elites don't respond to non-violent action, then you know what's going to come next. Is people other than Extinction Rebellion will use violence. That's what's coming down the road. I mean, I'm speaking as a sociologist here. I'm not saying it's good or bad. What I'm saying is, if you put a society under a massive amount of stress, if you propose,
will you?
Just leave me a minute. Just let me finish this. If you tell the citizens of a country that the government is facilitating their death, then you can expect one thing. Particularly in a country like Britain, where people don't put up with such nonsense, you can expect rebellion.
Will you? Just answer the question. Will you try to close down Heathrow Airport with drones?
It hasn't been decided, and I don't want to talk about specific things because that's not up to me. Right? That's up to the people that are engaged in it. What I can say to you is this is what's coming down the line.
Delicate question, man. You know, when someone's writing an eco-novel or a cli-fi, there'll sometimes be a lot of drones over airports like Heathrow, preventing planes from landing and taking off, right? Well, that's in a novel or manuscript, and as you will know, you're even allowed by law to murder a person or persons in, like, a crime novel. People die all the time on those pages in a book, if you know what I mean. So, in my case, the question of using drones or not preceded the creation of Extinction Rebellion. Call me a visionary or whatever, but having been a climate activist since my teens, it goes without saying I've considered a multitude of tools and action styles. Now, Extinction Rebellion started flapping its wings, if you can excuse the pun, about a year ago. People were sucked in through talks of non-violence and whatever, all kinds of kind and beautiful words and values. Then there was talk of using drones from I think it was May of this year, and following the first mention of active use of drones in XR actions, there was a huge and massive and long-lasting debate within XR about the use of drones. XR youth is against it, and XR elders were also against it. In fact, when the internal debate finally concluded in July, the very XR itself said a resounding no to the use of drones. Intellectuals were able to present the argument that the threat itself of violence amounted to a breach of XR's non-violence promise. And if you ask me, I've had quite enough thank you very much of politicians breaking their campaign promises. If you commit hundreds of thousands of ordinary folk in UK and across the planet to non-violent climate action, you can't just flip-flop and go violent all of a sudden. People have laid down thousands of hours campaigning, fundraising etc. under the pretense this would be a non-violent movement. And guess what? Ordinary folk do actually care whether their cause is a peaceful climate campaign or a terrorist movement. So to just answer your question directly, I'm against a small group of XR elitists charging ahead with their drone plans even after a 3-month internal debate concluded with a hard no to drone actions. It's undemocratic and pretty darn reckless. A particularly bad idea is to let high-profile persons that everyone connects with XR go ahead and promote and carry out drone attacks, because that puts grannies, granddads, teens and just ordinary people in a grim, semi-terrorist light. If it was a separate group entirely, like Drone Flyers Against Aviation, DFAA, to pick a funny name, with no connection to XR and no people from XR, I would be more open to morally supporting it, although I'm still 100% opposed to putting people in planes and the air at risk. I hope that answers your question.
I'm David Saunders. I've been living in Bristol for about 10 years, and I'm kind of a bit of a green activist. At the moment, I'm working on a solar energy project, but I'm interested in housing and health and food.
Now, sorry, you mentioned solar energy. I have to say something about these solar farms we see in the countryside. Are you an advocate of those? Because I find them actually it's a bit controversial. What we had up until 2010 was solar panels appearing on people's roofs. Now it seems that they're fields, the sheep are being moved out or whoever, and solar panels are moving in.
It does rather look like that. The history of solar energy is it's been going a long time. You know, we've had solar energy since the first satellites went up.
But fields of panels. This is post 2010, post coalition government, Tories and Lib Dems.
Yep. And the reason that you've got it in fields at the moment is that the economics of solar tilted towards solar farms. And the subsidies that people got for putting solar on their roofs for a while became even better if you were putting solar on solar farms. So we've got solar on close to 1 million houses in this country. Is that right? Yes, about 800,000, something like that. But since 2011, we've got about 11 or 12 gigawatts of solar. And most of that is in fields.
What about the energy used to produce these solar panels and potential mining, all the minerals? Because we do tend to forget this, don't we, that when you're looking at something which is giving you free energy from the sun, there actually may be some kind of payback down the line somewhere.
Yeah.
You're also part of a much wider movement, which is this Extinction Rebellion. Started in Stroud, allegedly, and round here, and there's had implications actually all over the world now. A lot of people are recognising it, jumping on the Bristol Stroud bandwagon. But anyway, how do you think it's compared to previous environmental campaigns?
Well, first of all, I'm not an official of XR, so this is purely personal reflections.
I don't know. Do they actually have officials? Because they don't. I mean, they seem to be very kind of flat. In other words, organisationally flat. So that means that everybody who turns up at a meeting is pretty much on a level with everyone else.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But there are people who work full time with XR. They have a organisational structure which they call a holocracy.
So they're some who are a bit less flat than others.
Yeah, it's kind of flat, and anybody can form a group. That's the point. It's super democratic. You can form a group. You can form an interest group. You can do an action as long as you subscribe to the principles, right?
So, but it certainly seems to be working. What do you make of them as comparing them to other environmental groups you've seen?
Well, chalk and cheese. It's a complete shift. Things when I was a younger person, when I was young, environmental consciousness grew around things like Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring and the Club of Rome's report The Limits to Growth, which were influential, but nobody started, battering down council doors or parliaments. Then you had the Rio Earth Summit as the science started to come.
So when was that?
The Rio Earth Summit, I think it was in 1984, right? And out of that grew the Agenda 21 movement. So every council had got an Agenda 21 officer thinking about the environment. And it was all very leisurely and comfortable. And then you had, well, of course, you've all along had Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. But then the next popular movement was a transition movement, which meant everybody who was into, something alternative, macrame or, supermarket plastic bags or whatever, had a place that they could meet. And it was great. And, different things, initiatives. You got people growing food in Todmorden and everything. But again, it didn't change the world. And then suddenly, last year, a group of the COP summit said, we've only got 12 more years. It isn't 2050. Paris was, we're going to get carbon neutral by 2050, which means not in my term of office. We got 30 years, business as usual.
Yeah, so the present day politicians will be drawing their pensions by the time
exactly
the proverbial hits the fan.
But then you had the scientists coming up and saying, it's not 2050, we've got 12 more years. This is urgent. And something, I don't know the exact story, but like 100 scientists last year sometime decided that something had to be done. There was grassroots stuff going on as well. XR formed. And there was I think a protest outside the Houses of Parliament. People sat down in the street. They had an impromptu People's Assembly and decided whether they were going to get arrested or not. Some of them decided to get arrested. Some of them decided not to. And then a few weeks or months later in November, they were occupying 5 bridges in London. Then in the spring, they were occupying bridges in Parliament Square and Oxford Circus and Marble Arch. And then for the summer, 5 towns. So the public actions have been growing quite quickly and quite impressively. And they've now got a manual, called "This is not a drill," and it's kind of weird pink. It's not a little red book; it's a big pink one, but it's a manual with a theory of change and the logic behind how just lobbying politicians to do stuff doesn't work. And look at what we've had in this country. For the last 2-3 years, as far as I can see, politics has been paralyzed. We've had a single issue country around Brexit. Nothing happens. Nobody can get anything on their agenda. Meanwhile, everything's falling apart. Hospitals, prisons, everything, housing, homelessness, refugees, lots and lots of big problems. And Extinction Rebellion formed a year ago and managed to grab the political agenda. And they actually said, Parliament's got to tell the truth. Parliament's got to declare a climate emergency.
Well, it's just filling a vacuum, really.
Yeah, I think so. I just found myself fascinated. A friend of mine had been up to London, so he was telling me his stories, and I thought, I'm just going to check this out.
Okay, so you've just been along to one of their meetings.
Yeah.
Apparently 4, is that right, in Bristol every week?
There are 4 Extinction Rebellion meetings in Bristol every week. Yeah, Bristol Central, Bristol West, well, I go to the central one, but south of Bristol, and there's like a couple of 100 people there.
Wow. Okay, so, and the mayor came along?
Yes.
Marvin Rees.
And
was he there for the whole meeting, or did he just dash in and out?
Yeah, he was there when I arrived. They start off with, so the meeting's from 6 till 9. The first hour they have food, which is great. I normally arrive a little bit late, so I get there just before 7 when the meeting proper is from 7 till 9. Grab the last of the food and sit in the meeting. And Marvin was already there, and one of his aides or assistants, somebody else from the council, and he was there all the way through. And the meeting wasn't conspicuously different. He didn't speak. He was there to observe, see what was going on.
Okay, so what kind of things go on at one of these meetings? And what sort of, what's on the agenda? What's being discussed? Is it all reasonably amicable? Are people shouting?
Well, so first of all, there's a shared meal, right? So everybody's eating food, which is great. But
it creates the right atmosphere, actually.
It creates the right atmosphere. And they have this, there are sort of, they have got sets of hand signals that they use to run meetings. So you're eating your meal, and all of a sudden you see the person you're talking to has got his hand in the air, and the room's going quiet. And so the meeting is called to order by somebody putting their hand in the air. 10 seconds later, the room's quiet, and the meeting starts. Whilst people are still clearing plates away, things like that. And they start with some announcements. This is what we're going to be doing this evening. This is a report back from last week. A few people stand up and say things. And then it's maybe a speaker. I was at one a while back where they had a really good talk about airports and air travel. And one meeting was a People's Assembly where about a debrief and a report back of the summer rebellion. So we met and discussed, debriefed how things had gone when they occupied Bristol Bridge and camped in Castle Park. So it's very fast feedback. And this week, there were the meetings subdivided into 3 groups. One group looking at what's Extinction Rebellion's strategy going to be for the next year. Another group looking at actually the work of Joanna Macy, who is a great environmentalist. And this group were looking at her work. So it's the kind of training. It was a training session about the work of Joanna Macy. And there was another group, and I forget what they were even doing. And towards the end, and these groups are very well managed and facilitated, in my experience, and you get through a lot in a short space of time. They've got a lot of interesting group process work that they've brought in, and a whole section of them is called Regen, and it's about caring for each other and making sure that people are looked after. And they run their meetings and everything based on 10 principles, which are, everybody is respected, we are non-violent, and so on. So there are principles that people sign up to at an orientation. Oh, that's another one. How many people here are new for the first time? Lots of hands go up. Big roar of applause. Great that you've come. And they're shuffled off to another room to go through an orientation
process. Me as a bit evangelical, is it? Sort of almost like a kind of religion.
Yeah, but these aren't the sort of people you would see showing up for a televangelist. Because, one of the principles, the one thing about evangelism to me is that very often you're being sold a story. And the first principle in the first demand of Extinction Rebellion is that politicians tell the truth. So there's a lot of people telling the truth at XR meetings. There is an emergency. We need to do stuff.
It's a complicated world we're in, though, isn't it? Because, back in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of people were complaining about the rolling in of the motor car, the closing down of the railways, the arrival of plastic on the scene. Everyone, I think most of the people back in the 60s and 70s were saying, we don't like this, we don't want it, why are we having it? And it's taken, 50 years for the penny to drop, in a way.
Yeah. And, before that was really building up, the Limits to Growth report did this first. It was the first computer model of the global ecosystem. It was very primitive, but it did say, if you keep on doing what you're doing now, it's going to look pretty nasty in a few years. And now it does.
And that was an economic model, wasn't it? Limits to Growth? It was saying that if you're looking for economic growth, GDP, etc., there's only a certain distance it can go before the planet fails to deliver the raw materials or whatever, the people fail to deliver the labour force that you're looking for.
It was modelling economic processes as they were then. And the point is, it seemed that as you grew your industry, you were inevitably going to be growing waste. There are forms of economic growth you can do now where you grow individual wealth and community wealth. You don't extract profits, and you reduce pollution and you reduce waste. So,
God, economics is a black art, though, isn't it? I mean, if you can make people pay for the air that they breathe, then that is a big bonus on the GDP, and it starts looking very good economically.
And but there are new forms of economics coming out at the moment. There's one that I like called Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth, and has a lot about recycling. And there's a really brilliant man, Jeremy Rifkin, who talks about doing economics he's saying that this third industrial revolution that we're going through is different to the preceding two. And in any economic revolution, he says there are three things you bring in: technology for energy, technology for transport, and a technology for communication. And they all cost capital money, and they all have running costs. So the first industrial revolution, technology for energy was coal, railways, and print, books and newspapers. Next industrial, and they all had running costs, right? So you needed capital, and you need money to run them. Next one, you upgrade, and it was oil and electricity, and it was planes and cars, and it was radio, television, and telephones. And they needed capital to install, and there were running costs. Next industrial revolution, solar energy. Wait a minute. The panels, installing the panels, the capital cost is cheaper than the running cost of the old energy system. And once you've paid off the capital cost, there's no running cost. Electric cars. Wait a minute. They're going to be cheaper than the existing cars that we've got. They don't pollute, and they're going to be running on dirt cheap solar energy. The internet, it runs on radio and phones. It uses the old technology, and it gives you communication that's virtually free. So you've created a society where the running costs are almost zero, and the capital, once it's paid off, you don't need it anymore. So you create a really efficient, waste-free future economy. There's a great free-to-watch movie called The Third Industrial Revolution with Jeremy Rifkin. I recommend that to anybody to really understand the shift that we're going through at the moment.
But with XR, we've even seen people chaining themselves to the Docklands Light Railway, public transport. But on a more serious note, there's a lot of people complaining about air travel. That is public transport. And surely the real shift we need to see is away from private motor cars to cheap and efficient public transport.
Sure. No question.
So why are Extinction Rebellion complaining about the very thing they want to see?
Well, I wouldn't exactly call aircraft public transport. Most airlines are not publicly owned. I mean, I would very much like to see.
Well, hang on. Taxis are public transport. They're not publicly owned. I mean,
okay.
Public transport isn't necessarily publicly owned.
Okay.
It's where the actual vehicle is used by anybody that wants to pay for a seat on it.
So what we are trying... So the first demand of Extinction Rebellion is tell the truth. The second is act now. The third is declare a climate emergency and then solve it, right? The climate emergency is caused by the emissions that we have put in the atmosphere with our fossil fuels, and it's going to be solved by shifting away from fossil fuels. Now, you can run trains on electricity, you can run cars on electricity, can't run planes on electricity. So there's a lot of emissions in aircraft, and they're saying
Well, hang on a minute, because you know there's something completely insane about the cost of flying to, say, Aberdeen being 1/5 of the cost of going by train.
Yeah, I agree.
So there's something hardwired into the system at the moment, which is driving people onto aircraft,
right?
Just for the profit, I should imagine, of the companies, of the train operating companies.
So once you start talking about climate change, you immediately get into details, and it's possible to, pick a point and move that in a direction. And what we need to do is look at the whole picture, model the whole picture, and then rather than special interest groups say, well, what about me and what about me, and you're not going to stop me doing that, they're suggesting that we hold citizens' assemblies as a new form of democracy to figure out these knotty questions. It's like having a jury and bringing in expert witnesses.
I hate to say it, but this is what the Gaddafi used to do in Libya. They had these regional assemblies which would feed into a parliamentary system, which he was a sort of benevolent dictator over the top of. So it sounds like we're taking a few ideas from Gaddafi in the Green Book here. Well,
there have been lots of innovations. I mean, if you look at Syria, they had a really good education system under a dictatorship. So any intelligent dictator is going to at least make his people comfortable, because if he doesn't, they're going to top him.
Isn't that the problem, that he might educate them so well that they realise he's a dictator and get rid of him?
Well, that seems to have happened. In this case, we're talking about deepening democracy. Deepening democracy and creating the shift from the problem with representative democracy, as George Washington explained it, was democracy as there's two wolves and a lamb, what's for dinner, right? And the wolves were the government and industry, right? And we're the lamb. He also said that freedom is a well-armed lamb contesting the result. And I think that Extinction Rebellion is the lambs getting themselves well tooled up to discuss with government and industry what actually is for dinner.
But what lightsabers of Extinction Rebellion got?
Direct action and critical mass. They understand. First of all, having a meal at the start of the meeting is very enticing and lovely. Caring for each other is great. Forming a kind of community is terrific. Making it really participative is very appealing to groups. And as I said, they're moving extremely quickly.
Where are they going next? Where can we expect to spot them next?
I don't know. But if you're sitting, there's a saying I heard recently, and it went, if the rate of change outside your organization is greater than the rate of change inside your organization, you're living on borrowed time. And I see Extinction Rebellion as really majoring on rate of change, and other organizations that are failing to deliver what people want, like government.
Or the high street, actually.
Or the high street, right, are going to have to change as a result of this, I think. It's a fantastic social experiment, and I'm thrilled that it's grabbed the microphone away from the Brexit non-debate.
David, how do people follow your work? Have you got a blog or anything like that?
No.
You sound like the sort of person that would be up for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I've sort of avoided it. In a way, I've been a researcher for the last 10 years. I'm looking for the actual answers. I've got ideas about what you can do for unsubsidized solar, how you could change the way we do our housing. None of the ideas are original. I'm a fan of anybody with a great idea. Like, I love what George Clark is doing, saying, we need a housing revolution. We've got to be building 100,000 really affordable homes a year. So, housing rebellion, education rebellion, health rebellion, all of these things are possible. And I've just had the kind of privilege for the last 10 years of being able to research this stuff.
So were you on social media or anything like that?
No. I've stayed well away from it until there's no point in preaching to people. I worked quite closely with a social housing developer who ran Hamilton House in Stokes Croft, owned Hamilton House in Stokes Croft. And he was pathologically shy of publicity. He was only interested in what he called laying down markers, showing people what could be done. And he built some of Bristol's first eco homes. He tried a housing charity. He set up a anaerobic digester energy company. He ran lots of experiments while, unfortunately, providing emergency shelter accommodation to the council. And he was, terrifically sad to see that homelessness doubled in the 10 years I was working with him. And he wanted, eco-villages, affordable housing.
So you're not so much of a talker, you're a doer. But you've had a bit of a chat tonight.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you very much, David Saunders.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Well, that's all for this week. Dialects Bristol's first weekly MP3 podcast.